Peer review comments. We have one peer review comment that will follow. Background information on the ground effect by Tim Michael.
In this section, I will discuss ground effects and whether these effects could prevent a Boeing 757-200 flying at 540 miles an hour, 10 feet above the ground, and impact the Pentagon. Some people believe that a Boeing 757 could not come close to the ground because the ground effects experienced by the plane would be so intense that the plane would be forced back skyward. I will show in the course of this presentation that ground effects cannot prevent a plane from reaching the ground, specifically because it was traveling so fast. Additionally, I will show that it isn't ground effects that would challenge a pilot in this instance, but rather the fact that the plane was being flown full throttle and far beyond maximum velocity Boeing recommends that a 757 should have been flown. Lastly, I will infer that it is highly unlikely that Hani Hanjour could have flown this plane and that we must consider other possibilities. There have been so many images of planes flying through thin clouds producing those dramatic downdrafts and vortices that we have come to believe that at high speed that these vortices and downdrafts would become much more intense, preventing a plane from flying near the ground. As we shall see during the course of this presentation, this just isn't the case. In order to understand why ground effects wouldn't prevent an airliner from flying near the ground at high speed, we will first need to understand several properties of flight. We will need to know what angle of attack is, what induced drag, parasite drag, and total drag is, what downwash is, and what the effect throttling the engine has on lift, and what happens when a plane is flown beyond the velocity never to be exceeded. Angle of attack is the angle that the wing makes with respect to the oncoming stream of air that the plane encounters as the plane flies forward. What is important for our discussion is that as a plane increases its speed, that angle of attack required to produce sufficient lift to keep the plane in level flight decreases. This is because the amount of lift just needs to equal the weight of the plane and no more to keep the plane level. As we can see from the diagram, lift is related to the angle of attack. We can also see from the formula for lift that lift is also proportional to the square of velocity, implying that as velocity doubles, lift increases by a multiple of 4. This means that the angle of attack only needs to be 1/4 of what it was at the lower velocity. This additionally means that as velocity increases, the angle of attack becomes closer to parallel to the oncoming airstream, meaning the airstream is bent downward at a smaller angle, creating a shallower downward flow of air beneath the plane. There are two parts to induced drag: the drag caused by the configuration of the wing, and the angle of attack that pushes against the oncoming stream of air as it diverts it downward in the process of producing lift, creating a drag force reducing the effective thrust of the engine. The second part is caused by some of the air from the underside of the wing spilling around the tips of the wing, producing the characteristic vortex, also reducing the effective thrust of the engines. It is these two properties of drag that causes ground effects when a plane is coming in for a landing. After a plane takes off from an airport and gains speed, however, the induced drag diminishes as the angle of attack becomes closer to parallel to the oncoming airstream at higher airspeeds. At sea level, since lift is 1.5 times greater than at 30,000 feet, an even smaller angle of attack is required to keep the plane in level flight. This means that an aircraft flying at 540 miles an hour would have to come very close to the ground, much closer than 1/2 wingspan rule for a plane landing at an airport. Parasite drag. Parasite drag has no effect on ground effect. Parasite drag is caused by the friction between the outer skin of the aircraft and the oncoming air. At low speed, the friction, and thus the parasite drag, is very low, but at high speed the parasite drag becomes much greater, and as the plane approaches Mach 0.8, the force of the parasite drag becomes nearly as great as the thrust of the engines, limiting how fast the plane can actually travel. Parasite drag is very important to the handling of the aircraft at low altitude and high speed, however, because air density is 3 times higher than at 30,000 feet, putting considerable more strain on the airframe, making it much more difficult for the pilot to execute a precision descent. Total drag. Total drag is just the sum of induced drag and parasite drag. As you can see by the chart on the right, as speed increases, induced drag approaches zero and parasite drag increases dramatically. Total drag starts out high at low speed because of the high induced drag at low speed, and reaches a minimum where induced drag and parasite drag equal each other, and then increases dramatically along with parasite drag as the speed continues to increase. What is important to note here is that at 540 miles per hour, induced drag that is responsible for a significant amount of the ground effect is nearly zero. Downwash. Downwash is what actually keeps the plane airborne. Downwash is a function of the angle of the wing with respect to the airstream, or angle of attack, and that pushes the airstream downward as it comes in contact with the wings. As the speed of the aircraft increases, the angle of the downwash decreases, reducing the height above the ground where ground effects come into play. When a plane is traveling 540 miles an hour at sea level, the angle of attack is so small that downwash only produces ground effects when the plane is very close to the ground, under 1/4 wingspan, not the 1/2 wingspan rule for planes coming in for a landing. There isn't a lot of discussion of this in the literature because there is no occasion where a plane would be flying 10 feet off the ground going 540 miles an hour or 100 miles per hour faster than Boeing recommends that the plane be flown at sea level. Effect of engine throttle on lift. With a constant angle of attack, when a pilot pushes forward on the throttles, increasing the thrust of the engines, the plane will tend to climb as the airspeed increases because the vertical component of the velocity of the air being directed downward also increases, increasing lift. Thus, a small angle of attack at high speed produces the same lift as a large angle of attack at low speed. On 9/11, the large commercial jet coming into the Pentagon was coming in at full throttle, meaning the lift of the plane was continually increasing until the jet impacted the Pentagon. This is important in understanding the difficulty of making a precision descent into the Pentagon. The aircraft operated far beyond VNE. The velocity never to be exceeded at 30,000 feet for a Boeing 757-200 is 660 miles per hour. The velocity never to be exceeded for a Boeing 757-200 at sea level is 414 miles per hour. A Boeing 757 can fly beyond the maximum speed Boeing recommends and can continue to increase in speed until the force of the parasite drag equals the thrust of the engine, arresting further increase in speed, or until the airframe begins to break apart. Pilots flying a 757-200 in flight simulators noticed that the indicators in the flight simulator showed that the control surfaces of the plane were beginning to flutter, indicating the plane was reaching its structural limits. This means that the 757-200 was so far out of operating limits when it came into the Pentagon that it would be exceedingly difficult for an amateur pilot to execute a precision descent into the facade of the Pentagon under these circumstances. It should be noted that the aircraft that hit the Pentagon, if it was a Boeing 757-200, was only flying outside of VNE for the last 34 seconds, meaning that the plane did not have a whole lot of time to experience structural failure. Ground effect when landing an aircraft. When an aircraft is coming in for a landing, and its airspeed is low, the angle of attack must be high to maintain lift. This produces maximum induced drag and produces large wingtip vortices. Because of this, when the plane comes within one-half its wingspan from the ground, lift begins to increase dramatically because, 1, the wingtip vortices are disrupted, increasing the effective thrust of the engines, and 2, downwash begins impacting the ground, spreading out the downwash, producing an effect as though the surface of the wing increased, also increasing lift. Parasite drag is not affected by proximity to the ground, so it plays no part in ground effect. When pilots discuss ground effects, they are talking about ground effects when coming in for a landing at high angle of attack, producing large wingtip vortices and a downwash directed at a steeper angle toward the ground. They aren't talking about flying a plane beyond V&E at 540 miles an hour near the ground where induced drag would be near zero. Ground effects when flying 10 feet above the ground at high airspeed. When flying a plane at high speed near the ground, induced drag is negligible, and the angle of attack of the plane and the angle of the downwash with respect to the oncoming airstream is closer to the horizontal, implying that the aircraft would not feel ground effects until much closer to the ground than one-half wingspan rule when coming in for a landing. The only thing that comes into play when traveling at high speed near the ground is the downwash when it begins to encounter the ground, thus increasing lift, but this only occurs when the plane is much less than 1/4 of its wingspan from the ground. This may seem counterintuitive, but at high airspeed, the ground effects are actually considerably less than at low airspeed when coming in for a landing, meaning that the plane coming into the Pentagon at 540 miles per hour would be able to hit its target without ground effects significantly affecting its trajectory. Ground effects, putting it all together. The large commercial jet that came into the Pentagon was traveling at 540 miles an hour under full throttle for the last 34 seconds of its flight. It was one-half wingspan or less from the ground for the last 2,000 feet of travel into the Pentagon, and less than 1/4 of a wingspan from the ground for the last 814 feet of travel into the Pentagon. The total time that the aircraft coming into the Pentagon would have experienced ground effects at 540 miles an hour at sea level would only be around 1 second, hardly enough time to cause the aircraft to lift significantly considering the huge momentum of this plane. The much more significant problem for the pilot would be negotiating a precision descent into the first floor of the Pentagon while at full throttle, while accelerating to 540 miles an hour, 100 miles per hour beyond V&E for a 757-200 at sea level. Approaching plane was more than one-half wingspan above the ground. This slide shows the altitude of the plane that was coming into the Pentagon according to many sources. I think you can see from this graphic that the plane was around one-half of a wingspan from the ground for only the last 2,000 feet of travel to the Pentagon, and 1/4 of a wingspan from the ground for only the last 800 or so feet of travel to the Pentagon. Too short a distance for the plane to react significantly to any ground effect. Pilots' attempts on flight simulators. When seasoned pilots attempted this maneuver on 757 flight simulators, they had difficult to impossible times hitting the Pentagon. One 20-year veteran Air Force and commercial airline pilot had to attempt this maneuver 5 times on the flight simulator before being successful. On his 5th try, he initially set the angle of attack to a negative value of 1.5 degrees and then pushed forward on the throttle, which, because of the increased lift produced by the thrust of the engines, leveled the plane out at 10 feet above the ground and into the Pentagon. This is completely counterintuitive for the pilot because they never practiced flying a plane under these conditions. Interestingly, the value obtained from the angle of attack from a decoding of the alleged FDR for AA-77 by Warren Stutt indicated that the plane was coming in with an angle of attack of minus 1.15 degrees, very similar to what this pilot had to do on the flight simulator. Ground effects conclusion. Though it would be very difficult to fly a Boeing 757 into the Pentagon at 540 miles an hour, it would not be impossible, and seasoned pilots, after practicing this maneuver, were able to successfully execute crashing a 757 into the Pentagon on flight simulators. Ground effects would not have the same degree of influence that many of us had initially imagined, so ground effects can be ruled out as preventing a 757 from impacting the ground floor of the Pentagon. The fact that the aircraft was operating far outside VNE and accelerating all the way into the Pentagon would still make the aircraft very difficult to pilot even for seasoned pilots trained on 757s. For a pilot like Hani Hanjour to get lucky and execute this maneuver on his first try strains credulity. I conclude with the chart on the next slide, which asks you to think about whether it is more likely that a human pilot flew this plane into the Pentagon or whether it is more likely that a modern custom flight termination system flew this plane into the Pentagon. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation.